Welcome to the Wickedly Smart Women podcast, featuring stellar conversations with emerging and established wickedly smart women. Thanks for joining us today as we celebrate women who are committed, care deeply, and have the courage to take action and create conscious change all around the world. Now here's your wickedly smart host, Anjel B. Hartwell.
Welcome to another episode of the Wickedly Smart Women podcast, where we celebrate wickedly smart women and provide our listeners with a wealth of wisdom, along with immediately actionable steps to be smarter, spunkier, and more successful in their impact and their leadership. This is your host, Anjel B. Hartwell, and today we welcome our special guest, Dr. Katona Linn. Dr. Ann is a passionate educational coach, speaker, author, and leader across the United States. She has dedicated her career to helping schools and communities develop safe, supportive, and positive environments. And I am so excited to have you here today on the show. Welcome, Dr. Ann.
Thank you so much for having me, Anjel. I'm excited to be here.
Beautiful. Well, I love to start with asking Dr. Ann, were you always interested in education? Was this something like, were you the little girl who set up the classroom and had her stuffed animals all lined up and getting instruction from you? Or was education something that you grew into?
So that's a great question. I would say that education was something that I grew into, even though I've always been a teacher at heart. So even though I didn't really think about it as much, I loved different aspects of teaching. And always, no matter what I was doing, I always loved working with kids. And actually, I taught swimming lessons because my mom taught swimming lessons. So from a young age, I was recruited to help out. So I had been teaching for a long time informally. So.
All right. Beautiful. So let's talk about how you ended up in the consulting industry. Was that something that kind of grew naturally out of your love for teaching, or was that like a lateral move? Give us a little bit of background.
Yeah. So my transition, I actually was in physical therapy and athletic training in my previous life. And again, worked in schools and worked a lot in schools. And then teaching as a special education teacher and a behavior analyst, all of those things. I had childhood trauma that impacted me significantly. And around in my early 30s, I had the realization that, okay, this is still impacting me. And I ended up getting into special education and behavior analyst because I wanted to figure myself out. So as I was teaching, and I gravitated towards the kids who were the most challenging. And just because I felt like I got them, and I really had a special place for them in my heart. So I worked with kids with autism and emotional support. And from that, I started working and just naturally had some skill. I was natural at it. Mm-hmm. And so I had bosses who had asked me to do some training and for my colleagues. And I was like, okay. And so I started doing some training. And then from there, that was kind of the beginning of it. It really exploded. From there, I really got into, I actually was working at the state level and doing consulting for the department that was really focused on training and technical assistance in schools across the state. And I was there for 7 years and just loved it. And I really was introduced to coaching while I was there as well. And so that consulting and the coaching, those pieces they go together. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of part of a continuum of this supporting people. And so that was how I originally was introduced. And then the more I just kind of was immersed in all of that, I just really fell in love with it. The last thing that I think really had a big impact on me was I was a state project director for Safe Schools, Healthy Students, which was a big grant, came out of the Sandy Hook and Columbine shootings, and really focusing on kind of creating those positive environments for kids. And we did a lot of work around trauma-sensitive schools. And through that work, I just felt like, okay, this is really what I should be doing. Mm-hmm. And because, I was doing a lot of work on myself and then helping schools kind of one of my gifts is like connecting the dots and helping to see the big picture so that we can break down barriers, break down silos. And that is what really, my own story of my own trauma really kind of solidified my love of working with schools. And so I do consulting and coaching. I do a lot of the training piece where I'm really helping the teachers to be more successful. So
beautiful. Well, and by extension, of course, the children.
Yeah.
So let's talk about trauma, Dr. Ann, because there's a lot more awareness around trauma than there used to be. A lot of people have ideas about trauma that are maybe not exactly what's totally true about trauma.
Yes.
Obviously, school shooting is a huge thing, which we're going to get into that a little bit later. But I'd love to have you start by just giving our audience, at least from your perspective, how you would define trauma.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So trauma, a lot of times people think of a trauma as like a physical trauma, but really trauma is an event or a series of events. This is really the SAMHSA definition. And it's those things that are experienced by us as an individual and sometimes collectively that really can have lifelong effects on us. So there can be a variety of different things. So for my trauma, the trauma that I experienced was a single event. It was a car accident that I was 4 years old and I went through the windshield. So that was an event. And then when I got to the hospital, they wouldn't allow my family to stay with me. So I was in the hospital at 4 years old by myself for an entire week. They were only allowed to visit during visiting hours. So that was an additional trauma that, obviously having these abandonment, feeling abandoned was kind of added on to that initial trauma and having surgery. So there were multiple different events that were kind of all connected. And then when I got home, and many times we still do this, like, okay, let's not talk about it. Let's just let it go. And if they don't bring it up, if we don't see any problems, let's just move on. And again, we still often do that. For me, though, I ended up with full-blown post-traumatic stress disorder. Mm-hmm. So those events, because of the time period, trauma has a most significant impact for kids under the age of 18, and especially within those first 5 to 6 years of development. And they can have lifelong effects, not just emotionally, but physically on our physical health. And obviously traumas happen to adults as well. There are many factors, what kind of protective factors do we have in place that prevent it from becoming post-traumatic stress disorder? A trauma is individual. One thing that can happen to one person may not have the same impact on a different person. So it's very personal. We all have our own, how we're affected by an event, but it's that event that we experience, and we may experience it in different ways, whether it's happening to us personally or we're witnessing it or we've heard a lot about it. And then it has long-lasting effects. So those are kind of the criteria for what trauma is.
Right.
And the effects, again, are every aspect of our lives, really. Relationships, physical health, mental health, emotional health, all kinds of things, our own self-worth. I know a big thing for me was just feeling I had a lot of shame that something was wrong with me for my entire life, and I always had that thought. So.
Right. So I've actually been diving in deep myself into the trauma realm, doing some self-work around that. And what I heard there was your trauma was like a combination of shock trauma, emotional trauma, surgical trauma, and then post all of the event, there was the suppression, kind of almost like oh yeah, that's over, let's get over it, which for many people who are middle-aged or older, we may have experienced a lot of trauma in our childhood that is still unresolved, both physiologically as well as psychologically and emotionally.
Yeah.
Right. So I just wanted our listeners to hear that. And trauma can also be a single event, or it can be constant,
Yeah.
I grew up with an alcoholic dad.
Yeah.
So so for me, it was like my entire childhood. So
Yeah.
An alcoholic dad and a physically abusive mom will, that's a long-term chronic trauma. So in your case, what you are doing in your work as an educational coach, speaker, author, etc., consultant, are you like helping the teachers understand trauma better, or like to help our listeners understand exactly what you're bringing to the table when you get hired?
Yeah. So I think, again, because my experience, I have that personal experience as a child, and I was an internalizing kid, meaning people didn't even know what was really going on with me. I was good at wearing a mask. So I have that experience. And then as a teacher, just because I understood the kids, and I also realized how much stress the job alone creates. And, especially with everything in the last several years, COVID really threw even a bigger wrench into the challenges that teachers deal with. And what I realized is that I can spend a lot of time working with individual students. I was going to have a greater impact if I could really help the teachers, because what happens is that teachers don't get trained on these things, a lot of these things in college, before they're thrown out into the field. A lot of teachers get minimal training on classroom management and behavior and mental health and trauma. And so now, kind of getting more tools that I had, I'm so passionate about it. And I want to hear everyone's voices, because I recognize, again, because I've had multiple hats and I'm also a family member. So one of my big things is that I really focus on listening to the people who are impacted in schools. And that includes their families, that includes the students, that includes community partners. That's kind of one of the first things that I do, is let me make sure I know what it is that's going on. And what do you think that, what do the people think that they need? And then I help them to really break down silos. My goal is not to come in and say, you have to do all of these things and I'm the expert and I know better. My role is to say, let's look at what you already have. And I try to make it obvious so that then they can make decisions. So I try to empower them to make their own decisions rather than saying, you're going to do what I tell you because I told you so. And that's not the case at all. I'm the youngest of 7 and I'm not good with being, I have a little bit of that rebellious being told what to do. And so nobody likes to really be told, we want to empower people. And that's really trauma sensitive, is when we're looking at a system and making the system more supportive, not just for the students, but for the staff, because then that is going to impact the students and the family. So we have to look at the system as a whole. And that's kind of, I'm a silo breaker. I'm a barrier buster. Those are kind of the things that I really love to do. And I love, one of my nicknames is Spider Woman, because I like to connect the dots. Because a lot of times things are going on in schools that the left hand doesn't know what the right hand is doing. And they're often just like some subtle little things that we can shift that can really have a huge impact. So that's where my coaching comes in. Like, I feel like I do a lot more coaching rather than the consultation piece.
All right. So we'll talk about that when we come back from the break. Yeah. But right now we are going to take a quick break. Great. So Wickedly Smart Women, we could use your help. If you are enjoying this show, please consider joining our community, making a donation at wickedlysmartwomen.com, and sharing with your lovely lady friends that might benefit from our content. Help a gal out and let your sisters, mothers, daughters, friends, and colleagues know about the show so that we can serve them too. I'm going to say a big thank you to all of our listeners who are downloading, rating, and reviewing. We are now up to 116 countries. The last time I checked, a couple weeks ago, I got to look again. And I want to just say thank you to all of our listeners. We are welcoming thousands and thousands of downloads from all over the world. We're going to shout out this week to our listeners in Brazil, China, Panama, which is PA, it's the Panama country code, and PA, Pennsylvania, where Dr. Ann lives. And we will be right back with Dr. Ann Katona Linn.
The Wickedly Smart Women podcast is brought to you by the Wealthy Life Mentor. Women, are you on the edge knowing that life is calling you to make a change? Are you ready to be part of the evolution of what it means to be a wickedly smart woman, creating your wealthy life by design? A life that is an extraordinary work of art. Anjel B. Hartwell, the Wealthy Life Mentor, is hired by women in transition. Women just like you who want to break through to their brilliance, become clear on the value of their wisdom, and embody a beauty-filled, balanced life of shameless self-expression. Discover your wealthy life readiness by taking the quiz at quiz.wealthylifementor.com.
And we are back with Dr. Katona Linn. You can actually find out more about her and her consultancy at KatonaLinnConsulting.com. KatonaLinnConsulting.com. We will have that for you in the show notes. So before we went to the break, you were talking about how you help with the consulting piece, where you go in to look at the system and break through some of the barriers and help the left hand to know what the right hand is doing. But you also do coaching. Now, when you are doing coaching, Dr. Ann, is that something that the teacher hires you for, or is that something that the school system hires you for? Because, one of the major challenges for teachers, in addition to the fact that they're dealing with, so much stress now because of just the bizarreness of our world at this point, where people have access to do serious damage to people, is that they're grossly underpaid. So they're overworked, they're overstressed, and they're underpaid. So can you talk a little bit about how you can help them with the coaching work that you do?
Yeah. Usually I work directly with the school or a district, and they're usually the ones that hire me to come in and help them. So, and I work at all levels. So I work with like a superintendent and the building principals and the teachers. And again, even the students. I try to work with everybody, because if I try to just work with one group and the system is still kind of broken, if that environment is still broken, then all the skills in the world aren't really going to help. So I kind of look at both of those. One of the big things that I'm really excited about doing right now is I am doing a building resilient classrooms model, where it's a coaching model where we have 12 modules that are all based on evidence-based practices. But one of the challenges that teachers often have is they get professional development. They may go to a whole day of training and get some great ideas, but then they go back and not a whole lot gets changed or implemented in their classroom because it's just, they don't have the support, they don't have the time. Mm-hmm. So I really broke this down into micro modules, micro learning modules, and talking about being trauma aware and building resilience and classroom management components that help to build resilience and build relationships, how to be effective with engaging students in your instruction, embedding strategies into our instruction. So it's not just, these are separate things, helping to deal with conflicts. So kind of this restorative practices. So I took these modules and tried to focus on what are the biggest challenges that teachers are dealing with right now, and try to give them specific skills for each module. So they go through the module, then there is group discussion, and then they get individual coaching around that module so that then they can practice implementing it. So it's not just here, go and do this on your own. It's really, I'm holding their hand to be able to make those changes. So I'm really excited for doing that one. And I'm just really going to be kicking it off in January, kind of to the larger, I'm doing this with the school, all of their new teachers, and we're expanding it to all of their teachers in the entire district. But I'm going to be kicking this off online as well. So people, no matter where they are, they can participate in, we're going to be doing the coursework, the small instruction, and then having group discussions. And, if people want, they can get that individual instruction. So I kind of have layers of it, but I'm really excited about this because I feel like this is something that is going to help teachers immediately rather than waiting until we change all the systems. We kind of have to do both. Let's start with the infrastructure and let's give them some tools that they can use immediately that are going to help improve what they're doing.
Beautiful. Well, let's talk briefly about the challenges that they are now facing, which I can't even imagine. My oldest is now 27, and I am so grateful that we escaped the age of school shootings. I am just so grateful about that. Yeah. How are you directly supporting, like what part of your work directly supports navigating just the potential reality, never mind anything post something like that?
Yeah. I'm glad you asked that piece, because in a lot of schools do have kind of either school police officers or school resource officers. And one of the big things that I try and get schools to look at is that, again, we can't have them in a silo. We have to have them become part of the culture and develop relationships so that they are part of the fabric of a school or district. So, there's that piece. And that we really focus on preventing challenges so that we're creating these environments where kids feel safe, seen, and heard along with staff. And, so bully prevention, teaching school-wide expectations so that they know what the positive behaviors, what they should be doing, teaching them coping skills as part of all of this, that these are all just skills that are going to help kids to be successful adults. And then the other piece is making sure that once we're doing all those things for all kids, let's make sure we're finding those kids that are under the radar. Like I said, I was under the radar. Luckily, I didn't do anything, significantly. We want to make sure we're finding those kids sooner rather than waiting until they're falling apart. So that's kind of where this infrastructure, this web of let's make sure we're communicating and really getting kids help sooner rather than later. And this is where we connect with community partners. Who do we need to make sure? This can't be one person's responsibility or one group's responsibility. Let's figure out how we can all work together to really address this collectively. And that's scary, though there are a lot of things that we can do. And I'm really hopeful because I've seen it. We've done it. I've done it in schools. And so I know it can happen. It's when we all work together. So
beautiful. I love it. Well, I want to take a little detour and talk about you as a business owner, because, we have a lot of women who are listening who are aspirational in terms of entrepreneurship or are in entrepreneurship. So if there's anything you'd like to say about your entrepreneurial journey, the part of your journey where you have, put yourself out there and you're doing business in the world, we'd love to hear that as well.
Yeah.
And maybe any impacts trauma has had on that.
Boy, that's a great question. I think right off the bat, that the imposter syndrome, I think, is even stronger for people who've been through trauma, because you've had this voice. I'm sure you understand this voice in your head that I'm not worthy, and this is kind of one of those things. And I think especially for women, because we're socialized to not be the squeaky wheels in many ways. So making sure that you always have people who are going to tell you the truth and encourage you. Like I have, especially women, I have other women who I connect with and work with in a variety of ways that are my support system. And so especially being isolated, I work in my basement. Yes, I go to schools and I go to do trainings and I do a variety of different things, but a lot of work I am doing at home in isolation. And so making sure I have that support network is key. Another key thing is don't be afraid to ask for help. Like I'm not an expert. I'm not a business expert. I had to learn a lot of things. Now, I've had several businesses actually that I had a home health agency. I lived in Florida and I had that and I started it from scratch and really expanded it. So don't be afraid to ask for help. And like one of the big things that's been one of the biggest blessings for me has been to have a virtual assistant who she's a part of my company. Like we are a team and it's really just phenomenal to have someone who can support you and do the things that you may not be good at and really focus on using your strengths so that you can go, okay, I'm good at this. I'm not good at this. I'm going to ask for help in that. And sometimes that means investing in yourself, whether it's getting a coach, it could be even just getting counseling. And I've done a ton of work, though. Whenever I come, it's like, ooh, I feel like this is impacting me a little bit more. Let me go back to counseling again. Let's do a little bit more. And your self-care, you have to actually, probably even the biggest thing I would suggest, you have to have boundaries. I have my office in my basement. I have boundaries, and people know what those boundaries are, especially if you're working from home, because it's easy for, I know sometimes my husband still does this, like, hey, can you do this? And I'm like, I'm working today all day. I have lots of meetings and I'm doing a training. So I can't, because a lot of times when people think, oh, you're working from home, that you have all this extra time to do all these additional things. And I think obviously COVID kind of brought that to light. So those are kind of some of so boundaries for your own self-care.
Beautiful. I love it. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Ann, for being with us today. And for anyone out there listening who's an administrator, a supervisor, a district person, a teacher, or even a parent who thinks that Dr. Ann's work might benefit your kids, your school system, please reach out to her at KatonaLinnConsulting.com. And listeners, we do love feedback. Please let us know what you thought of today's episode. Go right now to wickedlysmartwomen.com to join our community, share your takeaways, ask questions, or submit guest suggestions. Thank you so much for tuning in. Keep your ears open, and remember, you are a wonderful woman.
Thanks for tuning in, downloading, and listening. Be sure to rate and review Wickedly Smart Women on Apple Podcasts and share with other women who can benefit from today's episode. Wickedly Smart Women is the premier podcast series for informing, activating, and inspiring the leader who carries profound wisdom and knows that now is the time to welcome wealth. We welcome your feedback and guest suggestions and invite you to subscribe to our mailing list to be notified of each new episode at wickedlysmartwomen.com.